Well, hello. We're going to jump right into our next unit on the 1920s and the Great Depression. I always like to start this unit by I think addressing some of the visuals or images that we get of the 1920s. I think so often when we think of the 20s, we think of the roaring 20s, right? And seeing how we started off a new year in January 2020. I saw so many references to the Great Gatsby and to the roaring 20s theme. It looks like great fun in some regards, but I also think that we do the 1920s a disservice by having that be the visual that we associate with this time period. In fact, for many populations, the 1920s was not a positive time. And for some, it was a time of great crisis, both economically and socially and politically. So, my hope is to show all angles, or as many angles as possible, of the 1920s and to help you really start to understand where the seeds of the Great Depression are planted. I also think that you're going to see a lot of parallels. I have been saying for many years, in fact, last year I said I felt like in 2019 that we were living in 1928. There was just so many parallels and mirrors in so many ways of how our American culture and our economy was mirroring the experience of many in the 1920s. And so, as we move into this economic crisis that our country has shifted into with unemployment, I just saw today unemployment rates looking like over 20%. Recognize that you're going to be able to see some like links between the unit that we're studying and the modern era. And as you find those links, I really want you to highlight them for me. So please don't hesitate to shoot me a quick email to say, hey, is this thing in the 20s kind of like what it's like today? Whatever you see that might see parallel, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I really want to see those aha moments that you're having. So my essential question for you is, in what ways do we see liberal and conservative values at play with one another during the 1920s? So as you look at that question, liberal and conservative values, I need to define what that is, and you'll see that I have that coming up as a future bullet point. But make no mistake, I think the way that we should look at the 1920s is through this lens of one population having a different experience than another population is. And we're going to look at that in a variety of ways, both politically, socially, and economically. But first, I would be remiss if I did not start a discussion on the 1920s, but at least giving you some framework as to who the presidents were. I know I don't always do that, but I often think that these presidents in particular are disregarded, and yet many of their policies are the seeds of what developed into the Great Depression. So I think you kind of have to know who they are. The very first president of the 1920s is Warren Harding, and he is a Republican. He was elected in 1920, became president in 1921, and then he dies in office in 1923. Noting that he dies in office, please recognize that means that his vice president, who is Calvin Coolidge, it's this gentleman right here, he assumes the presidency because he was Warren Harding's vice president. He is of the same political party. He's also a Republican. And he gets reelected, or I should say elected to his first term in 1924, and serves another term. Leaves office in March of 1929. The third president of the 1920s who goes into the 1930s is Herbert Hoover. He is also a Republican. He was elected in November of 1928, takes a hold of the presidency in March of 1929, and then serves one term. He runs for a second term. He just loses his second term to President Franklin Roosevelt. I think it's worth noting some themes here. One, we have all Republicans serving throughout the 1920s, and that does not always happen where we have one political party sort of controlling the executive over a long period of time. But two, I like to note that the party takes a shift in the 1920s. So oftentimes I'm always interested when folks will say, well, so-and-so was a Democrat, therefore they're just like Democrats today. But recognize Democrats and Republicans today are different than Democrats and Republicans are in the past. And that is because, and I'll hit this point home to you in AP government, every 4 years, political parties have an ability to change their political belief system. They shift it. They change their ideology a little bit. We call that their platform. So they shift their platform. And it's all relevant to the time period. So, for example, we could expect Democrats and Republicans today, when they have their conventions in August, they're going to be examining their philosophy on how to handle pandemics. They're going to talk about economic bailouts. They're going to address platform items related to climate change and take positions on those issues. Platforms are positions on issues. Well, the Republican Party in the 1920s takes a shift, and they are a very different political party, a very different Republican Party than, say, Republicans of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Those gentlemen would have been deemed progressive Republicans. Harding and Coolidge and Hoover are far more conservative Republicans. And we'll look at what that means here shortly. But I think the heart of understanding them is to recognize that all three presidents are founded in a belief system of little government intervention. I'll take you back a little bit to the Republicans and some Democrats, of course, of the 1880s. If you go back and you think a little bit about laissez-faire and the Gilded Age and the nature of politics, then what you should is see some of these glimmers in Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. They definitely operate a little bit more like the presidents of the late industrial era, this late 1800s. They don't believe that it is healthy for government to engage in the economy or to engage in the larger world around them. They believe that the freest economy is one in which there is little government intervention. Naturally, as you can imagine, there are critics of that, just as there are critics of the concepts today. So recognize it is just those belief systems are based on your own values. So I want to shift and talk a little bit about Harding. Harding believed that the 1920s should be, and this is a quote from him, a return to normalcy. But what's interesting about the word normalcy is that it's relative. Like what's normal for you might be not normal for me. Maybe it's not normal in your family to have everybody eat around the table at the same time. That's normal in my family. We always have dinner together. So normalcy might look different for you than it does for me. If I reflect upon the time period that we're in, normal used to be, running around all evening to sporting events or going to practices and then trying to fit dinner in a 30-minute or 45-minute way. And then trying to get some homework done, etc. Like normalcy are your evenings with chaos for my family. And what we're experiencing right now, this calm, this like lack of a mandate or a requirement to go somewhere immediately in the evening, that's not normal for us. So normalcy can also be framed in different time periods based on major events. So Harding wants to return to normalcy. But I think if we think about what that means is that his sense of normalcy is specific to certain populations, meaning that what's normal for some is considered a positive thing, right? Like he wants to be, I think in many ways, a little more regressive than progressive. And there's nothing wrong with that for everybody. It just doesn't work for all people. It works for some people. So what are some of those ideas on normalcy and how do we get to these values at play? Well, I want to talk a little bit about what's liberal and conservative and then global and isolationist. I think the 1920s are very much this tie between things that are liberal and things that are conservative. So I think the best way to think of those terms, conservatives tend to embrace traditional beliefs. And again, that's normative. What's traditional for some people is not traditional for others. But try to hold on to that as best you can. Conservatives in general tend to embrace concepts that are way more traditional or historically valued. Liberals tend to embrace ideas that may have more modern approaches to them, or perhaps maybe more progressive, and seek a change from the way things are being done. Now, again, if you're a conservative, you might find that scary. For liberals, they see that as normal and would find conservative values scary. So it's not that one is right or wrong, it's just that they're two sides to a coin. Our presidents in the 1920s very much live in this conservative value system, one which they hearken back to more traditional belief systems that are historically grounded in our heritage as a nation. They also tended to value isolationism over globalization. So let's talk about what that means. Globalization means having the United States or having any country see themselves as a player on the world stage. Right. When we think of imperialism, we're inherently thinking about globalization, right? As the United States choosing to engage with other countries, wars are globalization by definition. We're fighting other countries. When we think of free trade or trade with other countries, that's the United States being global. Or if the United States is engaging in international organizations like the G8 summit or the United Nations, that's global by definition. We're engaging in problem solving with groups of other countries. Being isolationist is the opposite, right? If you are put into isolation, as we are very much feel like right now, we're not interacting with many people. If a country chooses isolationism, it is a belief system where the country chooses to not do much trade or has tariffs so incredibly high that it prohibits trade. It is a country that is choosing to not engage in war, but also choosing to not engage in problem solving on a worldwide scale. So countries that are isolationists would not currently today be members of the United Nations, or at least would be really hesitant to join. So I think going back and taking a look at these early presidents, recognize, I'm going to go back to looking at Harding and Harding's politics. Harding was very much an isolationist, and he was a conservative. And so his version of normalcy then meant that the United States was never going to join the League of Nations. And we don't. I mentioned this to a few of you in our Google Meet, but the United States never joins the League of Nations. It's not of interest. The U.S. never approves the Treaty of Versailles, right? This treaty that the United States is actually like the leader in writing, the League of Nations, which is Wilson's baby, his thing that was going to prevent all wars and to make the world safe for democracy. The U.S. never becomes a part of it. And in fact, the way that we officially end our version of what's going on in the war, right, that we say, hey, the war's over, is we pass a resolution in Congress saying the war is over. And that's it. So while there is a Treaty of Versailles, the United States never officially accepts the treaty. That is an example of how our country was moving towards isolationism. What are some other examples that we see? And this will come along with policy making, as you're going to find out. There's definitely some interest here in the United States to reduce government spending. So we would see this as an example of a conservative value. Conservatives don't believe in a lot of government spending. They like to curtail that. And as a result, that would mean that there'd be less money that an individual would pay in taxes, right? Like you pay money to your government so that they may have operations budgets in order to conduct war and pay for military and pay for social services. But a conservative doesn't necessarily subscribe to that and instead would prefer to see less government spending and would prefer to see less of their income going to the U.S. government for spending. So how do we see this conservative value played out in the 1920s? Well, the United States decides to spend less money on national defense, right? We just get out of a war. We've spent a lot of money on war. And so the U.S. government chooses to not spend quite as much, and they reduce the spending immediately. But realize that there's this potential, I'm going to go here to potential cost or consequences. You could place it however you'd like to. But realize that there's this sort of cost or challenge associated with reducing national defense. If the United States reduces the amount of troops that we have and weapons that we have available to us to defend our country, what does that open the door to? Hopefully, as you stopped and paused on my thought, it potentially could make us open to attack. Now, that's disconcerting, right? Like, the United States never wants to put itself in a position where it is easy to attack our nation. So, one of the potential solutions to deal with this problem, which I think again represents conservative values and isolationism, is that President Harding puts together what's called the Washington Naval Conference. Incredibly important event in American history, where the goal is to encourage other countries to also reduce the size of their military. One, they're going to, those other countries will be keeping in line with the values of the Treaty of Versailles, right? They'll be in compliance. And two, the United States doesn't have to worry about some of these largest nations in the world with the most powerful militaries being able to attack the United States. So ultimately, I always like to think of the Washington Naval Conference as setting these ratios. So let me explain. The countries with the 5 largest navies in the world, and we'll focus on navies. We've talked about navies before in this course and the influence of sea power upon history and why having a navy matters. But the countries with the largest navies in the world at this point was the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. So, the way that this was going to work is that the United States and Great Britain could have navies that were the same size, right? So that Great Britain could have a navy the exact same size as the United States, but it could not be larger. The thinking behind this is that Great Britain still is one of the largest powers in the world. They're an ally of ours coming out of World War I. The U.S. does not see Great Britain as a threat whatsoever. But at least we wouldn't have, the thinking at the time is that we wouldn't have to worry about them attacking us per se. Our militaries would be the same size nonetheless. Japan could have a navy that was a bit smaller. So for every 5 ships the United States had, Great Britain could have 5 ships. But for every 5 ships the United States had, Japan could have 3. So that gives you that sense of ratio. For every 5 the US has, Japan could have 3. France and Italy were therefore going to have even smaller navies. So, to put this in context, for every 5 ships the United States has, France could have 1.75 ships, and Italy could have 1.75 ships. Realize that means that France and Italy's ratio is the same. Their militaries would be the same size, or their navies would be the same size. And then there was going to be a 10-year pause on actually building ships. So one of the big agreements that comes out of the Washington Naval Conference is this belief that there was no need to build larger navies at all. There had been such expense associated with that in World War I, and so the thinking was to reduce it. How else do we deal with this budgetary concern of wanting to cut back government spending? Well, Congress in 1928, so at the very end of Coolidge's presidency, Congress passes the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And what this does is it renounces this aggressive use of force to achieve national ends. It's kind of like the philosophy behind the Treaty of Versailles. But it's a statement. Think of it like that, like a statement or a belief system that people sign off on, like a declaration, if you will. And many countries signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, including the United States. It was important to us, and we believed that if countries signed it, that would prohibit or prevent war. Right? Again, coming back to my key idea, if we want to prohibit war, that would need to happen if we're going to cut our military funding and choose to not spend as much on military defense. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. I want to stop with that. I think I've talked over some pretty key ideas. My second screencast for this week is going to address other liberal, conservative, global, and isolationist policies. I want to talk a lot about economic policies because I think that those are really, really important and probably will give you some big ahas about the modern world that we live in today. And again, as you see parallels, please don't hesitate to shoot me a quick email and say, hey, I saw this in the screencast and it made me think about this thing today. So I hope that you're seeing those parallels. And don't hesitate to ask any questions as you have them.